The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and FreedomSlips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, FreedomSlips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are back with another episode of Cosmic Catastrophe on Revolution.radio, where information never sleeps. I'm your host, Diamond, from the Oppenheimer Ranch Project, and joining us today, my lovely co-host and partner, Leah Shaper.
You said it right. Not Sharper, not Schaefer, not Snapper, just Shaper.
We got a great show today, Shaper. We're going to be talking about some very interesting finds, which leads to some perhaps controversial conclusions. But we'll get to that later in the show. About 5 years ago, a 42,000-year-old foal, which is a baby horse, was found up in the permafrost of Siberia, perfectly preserved, with appears to be no damage at all to the body, all of the organs intact, and amazingly, blood in its veins.
Liquid blood, yes.
Liquid blood.
Yeah.
Now, this wasn't the first time an animal with such amazing preservation has been found. For decades, they've been finding mammoths of all sizes, including baby mammoths, perfectly preserved, some of them with blood inside. But this was liquid blood, which got them a little excited. There are also other animals that have been found in the permafrost, perfectly frozen, up to 50,000 years old. Mm-hmm. And we did a show where we discussed the oldest known DNA found. It was extracted from permafrost, and it was 2 million years old.
Yeah, which is astounding. I mean, granted, it's going to be like severely fragmented at that point, but obviously it was intact enough to identify what it was, because it was a mammoth, correct?
Oh, no, they identified the whole biome.
Oh, right. That's right. I forgot. Right. Which is super cool.
The technology has gotten so amazing that from when they put in this genetic material, it can sort through all the DNA fragments, separate them all, and say, this is a squirrel, this is a bison, this is a that, etc. And They found dozens of species.
Yeah, because you're using those databases to make a match based on the fragment, right? You have a fragment, and then you've got this database, and it's like, well, there's nothing else that it could be. I'm sure some of it's based on statistics as well, on some level.
Yeah, I would believe that. We're also going to be talking about some controversial things going on, specifically the reanimation of ancient animals. There was a 46,000-year-old nematode that was reanimated from this same area, from this Siberian permafrost.
Well, and the extraordinary thing about that nematode is that it had the ability to be in stasis for that long, which is astounding. Yeah. And these things can reproduce now that they've been revived, which is
what are the implications?
Right.
We'll get to all of that. As we start the show with a picture for all you people in Radioland, we're sorry. A picture of that perfectly frozen foal. It's astounding. You could see the hair on its face.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it looks like it was just buried.
Yeah.
So let's go ahead.
I just remember reading about one of these. I think it was an adult mammoth, and they were talking about all of the different hair types that it has. So even after, thousands of years of freezing, that all of that is preserved. It's incredible.
Absolutely. So here's the 42,000-year-old foal. In August of 2018, a group of professional mammoth tusk hunters. Side note, I really want this listed on my resume. Oh, is this a bad article or what? Horse Nation. So in August of 28, a group of professional mammoth tusk hunters unearthed a nearly intact 42,000-year-old foal during an expedition to Siberia's Batagaika crater.
I don't know. I can't see. It's a little small for me. Let me zoom in there.
Batagaika. So here's the Batagaika.
Batagaika. Yeah.
The specimen was perfectly preserved in the region's permanently frozen ground. Let me repeat that. Permanently frozen ground.
Mm-hmm.
Which means that this area has been permanently frozen for 42,000 years.
Exactly.
Okay. How do you like them apples?
Yeah.
The following April, Smithsonian Magazine reported researchers from Russia's Northeastern Federal University and South Korean SOAM Biotech Research Foundation extracted liquid blood and urine from the specimen, paving the way for further analysis aimed at cloning the long-dead horse and resurrecting the extinct Lenskaya lineage to which it belongs. So this is an extinct Ice Age horse from the Lenskaya lineage. Absolutely awesome.
Yeah.
And we have a perfectly preserved specimen of it.
Well, so the other thing I find really interesting about this, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about this later, but I was finding there's a little bit of research in a journal article, which I haven't actually looked at yet, about mammoths potentially having like an antifreeze in their blood, right? So what they were discovering is that there was like liquid blood that would not freeze until minus 17C. And
that's later in the show. We're talking about the horse.
I know, but what my point is that this horse, although frozen, also had liquid blood, which you would think that even in freezing conditions, if the blood is liquid, that it's going to degrade. Like what I'm suggesting is that probably the only reason that this blood is liquid is that it probably also has some antifreeze characteristic.
Or not.
Well, then why wasn't it solid?
We'll get to that when we talk about the mammoths and the whole concept of the antifreeze in the blood.
Yeah.
So, but what they're talking about here, and with every time they find an animal like this in the permafrost, they want to reanimate it. I mean, it's like that's what they want to do. They don't want to study it or learn anything about the environment or diseases back then. They want to make it come alive again.
Right. Well, I'm sure the excuse is to be able to study it better and see it alive and, blah, blah, blah. But I have serious issues with that. Like to me, that's crazy and a huge mistake to try to reanimate one of these creatures.
First of all, it's not going to be that creature at all. It's going to be some hybrid of an elephant or a horse on Earth with some of the DNA spliced in from the ancient animal. So it isn't going to be that animal at all.
Right.
And it's just weird Dr. Jekyll science fiction stuff.
Yeah. Well, and then there's and so I think this kind of ties into what you just said, but there's the issue of the fact that largely what they found is fragmented DNA. So they really don't have anything to work with here. But I think that probably that would incline some researchers to take that fragmented DNA and use some other sort of DNA as a foundation in order to like rebuild this creature, which is then where you get like some kind of weird chimera or something.
Yeah, and that's what they're going to do using CRISPR, and that's happening now. It's probably already happening hidden on an island. There's probably already mammoth elephants.
Well, I mean, we already have in research laboratories, we have what are called humanized mice, right? Whose DNA has actually been altered in order to resemble human beings in certain respects so that we can better test certain things using mice. It's like, it's certainly not out of the realm of the possibility of like creating some sort of chimera, because we're basically already doing it.
And can you imagine if that DNA allowed the mice to have a human soul? So the mice is now thinking like a human, like, oh my God, what am I trapped in this little mice body?
Well, I think the DNA is just the vehicle, right? Or it's the instructions for the physical vehicle rather than the soul itself. But yeah, that would be really bizarre and strange.
Do you remember the island of Dr. Moreau?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that creeped me out as a child, that movie. Oh my goodness.
As it should. I mean, there's a reason we get spooked by stuff like this, because it's highly unnatural. It's against nature. You could say it's against God. And so I think we naturally have this like revulsion towards these things because It's not normal. But the other thing that's interesting is that we also have so many myths about chimeras. And I always wonder, like, why is that? And was there something that happened in the past? It's like when we have myths about giants. Well, it appears that perhaps we had myths about giants because giants actually existed. I'm much more skeptical of the idea that chimeras actually existed, but I have to ask that question because we have so many myths about them.
Yes, indeed. Back to the foal. I think those myths come from maybe a lot of it has to do with astrology and fanciful thinking of the Greeks and other people, and not necessarily. There's got to be some myth that's based on myth and not facts. You know what I'm saying? And that might be one of those.
Well, sure. I mean, things get distorted and twisted, right? Like we have myths about, well, I can't really think of a good example right now, but I mean, we have myths about serpents and dragons and etc. But well, again, I don't have a concrete way of explaining why we would have that based on real life experience. It's just a question of degree, I think, of how much things get exaggerated and inflamed and twisted.
Yeah, like the idea that they're going to find these perfectly preserved animals and then they're going to extract perfect DNA. It hasn't happened. They took 20 attempts at the most perfectly preserved foal, this one here, to extract viable cells, and nothing.
Yeah.
So these are clearly 40,000 years old. And even though they're perfectly preserved, there is a huge amount of degradation happening with the biology here, even though it looks perfect.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting to think of.
On another note, this picture of this foal, I keep looking at it thinking how interesting it is that, like, if you've ever looked at a foal in real life, they're so lanky and like clumsy looking, and this picture of this foal perfectly captures that, which is kind of interesting considering that it's been frozen for 40,000 years.
Yeah, they put a date 42,000, which is interesting because it's also coinciding with the mass extinction of other fauna at this time.
Mm-hmm.
There is a mass extinction that occurs 41,500 years ago at the Lachamp magnetic excursion minimum, and it even took out Neanderthal.
Yeah.
So I wonder if, and this is going to be for towards the end of the show, if there's some connection with magnetic excursions and the conservation of these animals.
Mm-hmm.
Now we can move on to the mammoth, which actually they were finding potential live cells in mammoths years before this baby. Up to 2 decades ago, they began trying to remove DNA and viable cells from these carcasses.
Mm-hmm.
This article published in 2013 says, can a mammoth carcass really preserve flowing blood and possibly live cells?
Mm-hmm.
Did you read this?
I did.
This is interesting. A 10,000-year-old woolly mammoth carcass that preserves muscle tissue, the color of fresh meat and blood in liquid form, despite the minus 10 degrees Celsius temperatures in the Novosibirsk island. That's where they discovered the beast. There's a couple things you got to glean from this. If it is underground in the permafrost and it's minus 20 degrees on the surface, it's not going to be that cold underground.
Right.
It's going to be slightly below freezing.
Right.
Yes. And so, like, that's an obvious thing.
Yeah.
So, but it's still below freezing. And there for such a long period of time, how is it still liquid? That's the question.
Well, and more than that, I mean, they took this liquid blood and stuck it in a freezer and tried to freeze it, and it still wouldn't freeze at minus 17. But it's funny because there's some sort of excuses being made for this. People saying, oh, it's not really antifreeze, or perhaps the blood was super concentrated at this point, so the sort of antifreeze components of this blood were concentrated, or there was some kind of bacteria that exhibited an antifreeze quality. However, 3 years prior to this article, there's another article from The Guardian from 2010 that refers to a paper that was printed in Nature Genetics describing how this antifreeze actually worked.
Do I have that?
I think I sent it to you. It's a Guardian article.
I don't see anything from The Guardian here.
Uh-oh. Well, that's a bummer. We'll have to include that link in the description box on the show tonight, but I'll just read a little bit from here. In the latest study, a team by Kevin Campbell at the University of Manitoba in Canada found another physiological trick that mammoths used to endure the Ice Age. Campbell's team isolated hemoglobin DNA from a woolly mammoth recovered from the Siberian permafrost and compared it with genetic code extracted from modern African and Asian elephants. The mammoth's DNA differed in a small but significant way. Changes in 1% of the proteins studied showed that it took less energy for mammoth hemoglobin to release its oxygen into the body as it coursed through the blood vessels. It literally allows their blood to run cold, Campbell said. Without this genetic adaptation, woolly mammoths would lose more heat in winter, and they would have to replace that energy by eating more. In winter, there's less food around, so it was clearly a benefit to have this. So, I mean, it's not exactly antifreeze, but I don't know, maybe it's related to the antifreeze element, because you have a creature that's functioning a little bit more like a reptile in terms of their blood temperature, which is pretty interesting. Because you have an animal that I assume by reading this means that their body temperature overall would be significantly less than you would expect from any other mammal, right? You know, cats run about 100 degrees, dogs run about 100 degrees, we run about 98.6. You know, maybe these mammoths are running more like 75, 80 degrees. I mean, I don't know how low that goes, but.
Well, and they were gigantic. So I would imagine that your idea about the reptiles that's pretty interesting. Up on the steppe up here in the Arctic where they're feeding on grasses, they're going to be very active and feeding spring and summer because the grasses are growing then. And just like out here when it's winter, the animals can survive, but they're eating the dried remnants of grasses by digging in the snow and that. Same thing with the mammoths. Their body slows down in the winter when it's cold, so they probably need much less calories, and they basically stand there.
Right. Well, so it's not that different than, so for example, here in
like penguins, together.
Yeah, but it's also not that different than here in the San Juan Mountains we have a lizard that you're surprised to see when you find it up at 8,500 feet, and then you go, because it looks like a lizard you would find in Florida or deep in the desert of the Southwest or whatever, which we're not that far from. But these lizards make it through the winter. I mean, presumably they're underground and hibernating for the whole winter, but in a way that hibernation is probably not that different than what was going on with these mammoths.
Yeah, because up at that altitude, it still gets below almost to freezing at night. So they can only ever be alive like during the day for just a few months.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think those lizards are probably underground all winter,
Yeah.
And not very active, right? Their metabolism is slowing down and they kind of go into some kind of stasis.
Well, there has been some pushback on the antifreeze idea after the Russian researchers announced a mind-blowing discovery. A 10,000-year-old woolly mammoth carcass containing blood that resists freezing to minus 17 degrees. Some skeptics came out. And a couple of things they noted is they have not found any living cells, like we said in the beginning of the program, even though it's such perfectly preserved.
Yeah.
At most, they could hope to find what the cloning enthusiasts might call a cell with viable DNA, meaning that it would be intact enough to use the context of a cloning effort, like we described earlier. So just a fragment of this or that.
Yeah.
Kevin Campbell of the University of Manitoba doubts that circulating mammoth blood could resist freezing at minus 17 C. Maybe Campbell offers the Russian team's liquid sample contains an antifreeze that was concentrated during the preservation. So the idea here is that, let's say the mammoth had, I don't know, it's gigantic, 20 pints of blood, which is probably low. And it mostly evaporated to this little bit of liquid blood left. So it's only like 2 grams of blood. So that antifreeze is now 1,000 times concentrated.
Right.
So that could be one problem.
Right.
And then he says it may be, like you mentioned, contain antifreeze secreting bacteria, which contaminated the sample.
So aside from the bacteria idea, I mean, if it's a concentration of the blood, there's still antifreeze of some sort there.
In the blood.
Right. And this is not that surprising. I mean, we know that some plants have this ability, right? Like kale is a great example of a plant that does well in the winter because it has kind of like an antifreeze component and does pretty well. So, you know, it's not that, 1.4.
Okay, so this is the issue. I think that the number that they get at the -17 is probably occurring because of the concentration. It would be impossible for a mammoth to be alive if his blood was at 3 degrees.
No, I mean, the live mammoth.
We don't have any animals that operate at that temperature.
No, I mean, it doesn't mean that the mammoth is still operating, you know, with its blood temperature at 3 degrees. I don't think it necessarily suggests that. It's just suggesting that it resists freezing.
So it could literally walk around at -40, kind of like some of our larger animals do in Yellowstone, and live.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So
or
I think
like,
that's what the antifreeze is for.
Like you can go to sleep without becoming frozen to death.
Right.
Right? Like that's going to be really important if you're in a climate that's that cold.
Yes, that's pretty amazing, that discovery alone.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm anxious actually to check out oh, by the way, I sent you the link in chat of the Guardian article if you want to put that up. And I didn't catch earlier that there was a paper that was printed in Nature Genetics, but the link doesn't work, so because it's an old article, so I'll have to dig that up later and check that out. Because I suspect that this shift.
Oh, that's why I don't have it. I remember looking and the link didn't work. It went to nowhere.
The link for the article should work, but the link within the article for the paper is not working. But I would suspect that this sort of hemoglobin adaptation may very well have something to do with the antifreeze function.
Indeed. And just like I said earlier, Fisher, one of the scientists, says, as for cloning, Fisher thinks other research deserves priority.
Yeah.
He says, I want to learn about the lives of mammoths. I have more confidence in our ability to generate new knowledge from the fossil record than our ability to learn from a cloned mammoth.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because the clone mammoth is not going to have the stomach contents of what it was actually eating back then. It's just going to be like a freak show thing.
Well, and you're not going to see it functioning in its natural environment. Well, here's another thing. Like here's another ethical issue. I have a big problem with the idea of bringing mammoths into this world, into a climate that they were never designed for. That's cruel. You know, that animal is going to suffer.
Not true.
There's a reason
mammoths survived in
Siberia. Extinct.
Mammoths survived in Siberia to 5,000 years ago, which was warmer than today.
Understood, but nonetheless, there is a reason why they're extinct, and it probably has something to do with the conditions that are not right for them anymore. You know?
Yeah, perhaps. So, do we need to talk about the antifreeze anymore?
No.
All right, well, let's move on to reanimation, which is kind of similar in the sense that these animals, in this case, a roundworm or a nematode, same thing, different descriptor. A roundworm is a type of nematode. Now, these ancient roundworms allegedly were resurrected from Russian permafrost. Of course, the U.S. media is going to say allegedly because it's Russia.
Yeah. Well, which is funny because this article is like from 2018 or something, isn't it?
Yes.
But yeah, I guess we've been poo-pooing Russia for a while anyway, because apparently the Cold War never actually ended.
Skeptics cite the possibility the ancient samples were contaminated by contemporary organisms. The only problem is that's not true.
Right.
So some organisms, such as tardigrades, rotifers, and nematodes, can survive harsh conditions by entering a dormant state known as cryptobiosis.
Mm-hmm.
And in 2018, researchers from the Institute of Physiochemical and Biological Problems in Soil Science, RIS in Russia, found 2 roundworm species in the Siberian permafrost. Absolutely amazing. Radiocarbon dating of the permafrost indicated that the nematode individuals had remained in cryptobiosis since the late Pleistocene, around 46,000 years ago. That is crazy. It's crazy because they survive like multiple mass extinctions, asteroid impacts, on and on. You're muted. You're muted.
Oops.
Yeah.
Well, and then I had trouble turning the mic back on. But they were frozen, so that certainly helped them survive.
Now, cryptobiosis doesn't mean you got to be frozen. Tardigrades can live in the environment of space.
Yeah.
So in that case, they could literally be preserved forever, in a sense. We don't know if there's a maximum limit. This is ridiculously long, and they were just fine.
Yeah.
So do you think doubling it would kill them? Probably not.
Probably not.
And they have the ability. So this is amazing. The whole world can go extinct.
Mm-hmm.
And then if the permafrost melts, it comes alive again.
Well, so I was about to say, yeah. I mean, so like in this case, resurrecting this nematode doesn't bother me because it's like, okay, well, if the climate changes where they're frozen, they're going to come alive again anyway. And that's really interesting to think about because they can probably survive the coldest of conditions on Earth. You know, and I have no idea how they would survive in the other direction in terms of warmth, but these nematodes are going to be around probably no matter what.
Yeah, and the skeptics were rapidly shut up because using genome sequencing, assembly, and phylogenetic analysis, the team found that this permafrost nematode belonged to a undescribed species, Panagrothamus Calimaensis. Calimaensis. They showed that the biochemical mechanism employed by this particular genus and species to survive desiccation and freezing under lab conditions are similar to those of a life cycle stage of the important biological model Caenorhabditis elegans. I don't know what that genus and species is, but apparently it had been studied and shows these same types of abilities.
Yeah.
Did you look into what that is?
Well, they kind of explain the mechanism in this article here.
Oh, so it's just another roundworm.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, it's right here. I just Googled it.
Okay. So, but the mechanism is survived here. So they say the research team next evaluated Penagrolamus calimaensis' ability to survive and discovered that mild dehydration exposure before freezing helped the worms prepare for cryptobiosis and increase survival at minus 80 Celsius. At a biochemical level, both species produced a sugar called trehalose when mildly dehydrated in the lab, possibly enabling them to endure freezing and intense dehydration.
So they need to be dehydrated first in order to make the long journey.
So mildly, apparently.
Which is interesting because at the peak of an ice age, when you're forming permafrost and other things, the Earth is exceptionally dry. There's almost no more precipitation happening. The dust levels increase ridiculously. It's like living here. You have humidity levels at 3 or 4%. So the conditions are ripe for preservation.
Yeah.
And the dates are ridiculous. 45,839 to 47,769. That's pretty tight.
Yeah.
And that is like at the bottom of the ice age.
Mm-hmm.
But what's weird, I'm going to pull up a graph of the last 100,000 years. What's weird, and this is a really interesting data set. You could see back here, what was the time frame? 47,000-ish, 46?
Yeah.
We've got this massive climatic cycle, which lasts throughout that entire time, where temperature rises instantly 15°C and then drops down into glacial maximum.
Yeah.
All within a period of, let's say, 5,000 years. And we've got this repeating cycle. Sometimes it's 2,000 or 3,000 years or less,
Mm-hmm.
with periods of cold glacial stasis in between. That's the dark blue.
Mm-hmm.
What is causing this?
Right. Right.
What is it? On a 1,000 to 3,000 year cycle, sometimes it's longer. Here's about 5,000, but there is a second cycle inside. Maybe there's 1, 2, 3. What is causing this cycle? Is this the Dansgaard-Oeschger cycle?
That's what I was about to say.
Is it being triggered by the sun?
Right. That's what I was saying, because these graphs are tremendously similar to the graphs that we looked at last week, talking about the collapse of the AMOC and the fact that it's happened repeatedly in the past. And then you can, but it hasn't happened for 12,000 years, which you can also see in this graph.
Yeah. So the AMOC collapsed on this last drop down here.
Mm-hmm.
Right here is the Younger Dryas. This drop all the way down. That's the AMOC collapse. And then it restarted and it's been going ever since. So also occurring at the same time here is a magnetic excursion.
Mm-hmm.
The next largest magnetic excursion is the Lechamp 41.5. And there's another dip here, but it's not any different than any other dip that would be a Dansgaard-Oeschger cycle.
Yeah.
So what I'm gleaning from that is strange. It's strange. It says the magnetic excursions, their effect is solely based on magnetosphere and increased radiation, very little climatic effect. The climate is being driven by Dansgaard-Oeschger, which is probably the solar dynamo here.
Yeah,
How
but
else
then
do you heat the Earth 15°C in a day? It's got to be the sun turning on.
Well, but also, like, what changed here, right? Because, we didn't start getting this, very frequent Dansgaard-Oeschger cycle until about 70,000 years ago. The 20,000 years prior to that, there's something similar going on, but at a much slower pace.
Yeah.
And like, what started all of this and what stopped it? Like, what's happening here?
Well, they're bigger cycles before that, and then they start to get like abrupt right here around 77,000 years ago. It's like boom, boom. And this is definitely the same exact thing. Whatever this is happening again and again. And it's angry and it's warm and it's cold. What is that mechanism?
Right.
And why did it shut off 11,500 years ago?
Right. Right.
And is it about to kick back on again?
I personally strongly suspect, and I can't really lay this out in detail, but that this has a lot more to do with our cosmic interactions than anything else. Like, there's something else going on outside our solar system that's changing the patterns of our interactions with our sun and the rest of the solar system, and thus our climate. Like, I often think when I see stuff like this about the idea that our solar system is moving through space like in a spiral, right? And that there's some shift, but we're moving through the universe, and so perhaps there's an interaction with another solar system or something that changes these kinds of cycles. And again, I can't lay this out in any detail, but it's hard to reconcile this as a function of a solar system that hasn't changed in, let's say 200,000 years. It's really hard to rectify that because, right, this is a perfect example. We have these 100,000 year cycles, and then we have 41,000 year cycles all of a sudden. Like, what's changing here? There's something much bigger going on that we really don't understand. And the problem is that we don't have the context because we can't sort of step outside of the timeline of our own human existence. Our lives are so short in comparison to all of this. How could we possibly really see what's going on here? And then even if you theorize this, how do you prove it? You know?
So it appears as if there is a rapid, well, it's a gradual increase in the variability. And the bigger the variability gets, the longer the periodicity of the cycle. So back here, very short, tiny, rapid cycles. And then the cycles start to get larger 2.5 million years ago. This is when we drop into ice age. It's as if we are approaching or moving away from something that is affecting us.
Right.
So that's to your idea. We could be getting nearer something that is causing this to happen, and we're getting closer and closer to it. And thank God it can't be Nibiru, because that comes every 2,300 years.
I mean, it could also be, and maybe this is a function of other things going on, and you and I have sort of talked about this in the past, just as a hypothesis. So if you kind of dig into expanding Earth theory a little bit, you could hypothesize that there are eras of Earth, that it's not a constant process, Earth expansion, but that it's happening periodically, you know, like maybe it's happening at 2.5, well, it's more like 2.7 million years ago, and maybe it happens again about 1 million years ago, and that somehow changes the dynamics of our climate pattern or something.
Well,
but
Mario
if that were true, then you would have to argue that something major happened in Earth expansion 12,000 years ago.
Yes, and that could be true. Mario Build Reps has the data to show poles every 100,000 years changing. So it would be the cycle that we're looking at here that creates the expansion effect, which can very literally be a dip in the magnetic field. You drop the field low. Every 100,000 years, you get increased energy into the core. The core builds, literally makes matter from energy, and the Earth expands. Well, and the Earth isn't a perfect layer cake, so it's going to differentially expand based on these low velocity zones that we're aware of.
So maybe what I just said a minute ago is not the thing. Maybe it's not that there's like a period of Earth expansion that stops. Maybe it's more like the dynamics and the pace of the expansion shift at whatever 2.6 million years ago, and then shift again at 1 million years ago, so as to create these 41,000 year cycles and 100,000 year cycles that we see in this data. So maybe the expansion is consistent, but it's consistent in a different way for those different time periods.
I have another hypothesis. All of these temperature fluctuations are from the sun, because the only heat that the Earth gets is from the sun. And if that's the case, let's go all the way back to the galactic superwave theory. And our friend, Dr. Paul Laviolette, God rest in peace, Dr. Paul. All the cool people have died. It's crazy.
Yeah, right.
So what if we are powered from the galactic center, and it is the dynamo at the center, the plasmoids there that are just this is the noise that our galaxy makes, and this is what has happened over the last 5 million years. This would be the galactic superwave, and for some reason, it's increasing in power. That could be a simple explanation. And it could be on a huge scale where we're now about to pinch down and go back into maybe let back through these slower and weaker cycles and then back up again.
Right.
It could be coming, and I think it is. If it's the sun, it's whatever's powering the sun is creating this cycle.
Right. And again, like not being able to get context on this. I mean, we're looking at a data set of 5.5 million years, which is about as good as it gets, right? So like the fact that we can't double or triple or quadruple this data set to see a larger pattern is really frustrating.
Yeah, because we don't have that much ice.
Right.
So we only have so much ice to take cores from to get this high resolution data. The rest is highly suspect and extrapolational. You know, there's periods where we have high resolution far in the past, some lake deposits that are millions of years old.
Yeah.
But they're lithified. So we lose all of the good geochemical information once it's a rock.
Well, that's another thing I was going to say, because this is actually sediment core data, right?
Yeah.
But it's still limited, like you just said. So, yeah.
But it's not fossilized, so it's got lots of stuff in it.
Right. Right.
Yeah. And they're using the benthic O18 ratio here. That's where they use that O18 benthic ratio to directly correlate to temperature, because in modern times, we can look at temperature graphs and the O18 ratios and extrapolate that back into the past, because it's a chemical reaction. It is what it is. It's not going to be different.
Right.
Yeah. So if the ratio is this, it was colder than it is this much colder. So what I can see is that, take a look at this. The last about 400,000 years has been much bigger swings in ice age conditions than ever before, the last 4 cycles. So we're in a new phase now.
Yeah.
And nobody, the good news is that the last biggie is over, right? That happened 12,000 years ago, and we've got an 80,000 plus ice age to endure before another one of these big things happens again.
Right.
That's good news, right?
Right. Right. Now
because there are a lot of people on the planet that think the Earth is about to tilt.
Yeah.
And with all the data we provided, that concept should be obviously ludicrous.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, if you have animals that have been frozen for 40 or 50,000 years, the idea of a pole shift that puts the North Pole at the equator doesn't make any sense, because how are those animals frozen then? That doesn't jive in any way, shape, or form.
Well, their argument would be that the tilt only lasts for 24 hours and then goes back.
Right.
The problem with that is that the speed in which you need to tilt the Earth would be catastrophic for all life in an instant. Nothing would survive a 45-degree tilt and back in 24 hours. Nothing.
Right. No. Well, which is funny, right? Because part of the argument for that concept is that you find these, like, huge piles of bones and trees and everything's all broken apart, and in the north is what I mean. But like you said, this would affect everything on Earth, not just animals in the north.
Yeah, the boneyard, they call it.
Right.
Now the boneyard,
we don't find this in other places.
Exactly. And there's good reason for that. The Arctic isn't as dynamic as lower latitudes. We had over 1 million mounds that were just a few thousand years old in North America, and now they're all gone because we have lots of rain, lots of weather, lots of erosion in the mid to lower latitudes, where almost none of that is happening in the Arctic. That's how we can get perfectly preserved animals for 40,000 years, because nothing is happening up where that permafrost was. It was just frozen, and it's just accumulating ice year after year. That's it.
Right. So you're not going to get erosion because everything's frozen. So, yeah.
Right. So that's why we have these deposits that are recent in the last 50,000 years up there preserved.
Yeah.
They were all over the world, but we have almost no recent deposits of anything like that because of erosion in the lower latitudes where it's raining, where there's things growing that are bioturbating the ground and destroying that. Does that make sense? What happened?
Yeah. I just saw, like, the title of the Guardian article just popped up where my picture is.
That's weird.
For a second. It was very strange. I don't know how that happened.
There's way different stuff going up on the Arctic as opposed to the middle and lower latitudes as far as weathering and preservation. You're going to preserve almost anything catastrophic that happens up there. It's going to occur. It's going to freeze. It's going to stay that way forever. So what we have in the Arctic is a perfect preservation of, wait for it, the Younger Dryas catastrophe. Hibberd in the 30s went up there and was the first person to describe the bone beds, the boneyards. Now, the problem is that many catastrophists of today repeat old talking points, which have been geologically been eliminated as being true. They're not true. Some of the initial investigations coming from the book that we have, I don't have it here, Colonel White or whoever that guy is, the chapters on the pole wander and pole flip.
Mm-hmm.
The geologic information presented in there was incorrect. They found tropical fossils that were 250 million years old. They weren't recent.
Are you talking about a small volume called Pole Shift that kind of reviews a lot of the pole shift theories?
The big $500 book that I have.
Okay, we have another interesting book like that I was just looking at yesterday.
Dr. Maynard White or Dr. Maynard Smith or Dr. Maynard White is the son of the guy who went out there to the Arctic and where all this nonsense came from. Mm-hmm. That account, the Adam and Eve story.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Well, also there's the problem of people will claim that the vegetation that, let's say, was found in the stomachs of mammoths and stuff was tropical or subtropical, but that's not
true.
But that's not true. What they found were the summer grasses of that climate.
All of the contents of the mammoths were from plants and animals that still are there.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's people that are just lying to you. Or they're lazy and they don't look into it.
Yeah.
Because you can't just read something on the internet and say it's true.
No. No.
What the truth is the data you're looking at here. This is the truth.
Hmm.
And what's interesting is mass extinction occurred right here at that point. But there are dozens of points like that throughout the graph. What made this so significant? We have additional data. We've got a platinum spike. We've got the, right? We've got the bone spike. We've got the boneyard that dates to 12,900.
We have all of the evidence of an impactor on the Laurentide ice sheet, which we've talked about on this show before.
The stratigraphy of 1 million Carolina bays date to 12,009.
Yeah. Right.
Which means there was 1 million projectiles hitting North America that all originated somewhere near Hudson Bay. How is that possible?
Right.
And yet there are skeptics that claim that it wasn't a comet.
Right.
The evidence is piling up. There was a large cometary complex that entered our atmosphere. It might have had something to do with the Bowling Allarod spike. It could have been that this complex started to screw with our sun, and the sun started to coronal mass eject, heating the Earth.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen sun-diving comets come into the Earth, and the immediate reaction is a CME.
Well, and then the other interesting thing about this is that you know, when you look at all of the data, it kind of looks like the Bowling Allarod was happening for whatever reason, and perhaps for the reason that you suggested, but that abrupt warming was interrupted for a period of time, and so it got cold again, and then the warming resumes and it continues on. But again, this is like this major shift in the pattern that we don't exactly understand. We don't understand why that happens, why that happened. Either way.
Because it happens every 100,000 years. There's not always this catastrophe every 100,000 years. This was a unique thing.
Yes.
So I think that comet complex starts interacting with our sun. It becomes very active over a period of short time. And then they start hitting Earth.
Right.
There are 3 episodes of temperatures dropping down. The first, the second, and the Younger Dryas.
Yeah.
The Younger Dryas is the final hit. So we have some small objects that hit early, darken the skies, but then it all comes in 12,009. It all lands on the Laurentide ice sheet. Some of it flies by the Atacama Desert and hits there. We've talked about that spot. Mm-hmm. Some of it hits Australia. All over the Northern Hemisphere is bombarded. Mm-hmm. And we have the complete extinction of megafauna in North America. Mm-hmm. Up to 70% of large mammals gone. We're left with
Well,
like
and that's the other
bison and
thing.
horse. Everything else is gone.
That's the other thing. It's like there are megafaunal extinctions almost all over the world, but not entirely. And it's a bit different depending on where you are, which does suggest a specific geographical something happening, right? It's not something that is happening to the entire globe at one place. It's something that happens in a specific place, and therefore the effects, depending on where you are on Earth, is different.
Yeah, most of the extinctions are Northern Europe, Northern Siberia, and North America. Like Africa, the reason there's giraffe there is because they didn't go extinct. They didn't die during the Younger Dryas. The megafauna made it in Africa, so probably didn't get hit or affected.
Right.
Unless you were on the shore, there were massive tsunamis.
Yeah.
And if the evidence suggests tsunamis literally washed across most continents.
Yeah. Yeah.
It wasn't from the Earth tilting. It was from a cometary bombardment.
Which would helps explain the boneyards, right? You have these piles of mass destruction, essentially. Or I was reading yesterday that off the coast of Alaska in the ocean, there's like just piles and piles and piles of mammoth tusks in the seabeds, which is fascinating because it does suggest water running over the landmass and washing things out to sea.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of these boneyards are stuck in the bottom of a valley. So if you look at the stratigrapher, anywhere there was a steep ravine, right now it's flat and covered over. But when you look at the cross section of why is this preserved, it was because this mud, muck, and all these animal parts. So you're up in the Arctic. Let me lay it out for you. It's freezing. It's winter. The mammoths are trying to get by, blah, 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 eating the dead grass. And this giant piece of comet comes and hits the permafrost. The heat, it's going to explode. It's going to melt everything. You're going to get this catastrophic slurry of permafrost, mud, and dead things. And they run into the valleys. They run out towards the ocean. Mm-hmm. And the valleys that are filled with the muck are frozen because it's in the Arctic and it's winter and they don't stay hot for very long. Mm-hmm. And that's how you get this preservation. Yeah. What's interesting is there are bodies from 40,000, 42,000, 50,000, 32,000, 36,000, 38,000. They're not all just during the Younger Dryas.
Right.
So what is happening there?
Well,
These are perfectly preserved.
Those
are
just
the boneyard, the broken up ones, perfectly preserved.
Right. I mean, I expect that those specimens are animals who died in the sort of natural course of life.
And there
thus
was a huge event happening, burying them, like a huge snowstorm, a blizzard. They were immediately covered in 10 feet of ice, permafrost, and then forever.
Right. So then by the time that 12,000 years ago comes along, they're already underground, preserved, buried, and so they're not going to be as affected by this natural catastrophe.
And it could very well be that when the comet hits, it is smashing into all of these frozen animals, mixing them up with mud and depositing them 12,800 years ago. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The already buried, perfectly preserved can get rebroken and refrozen.
Absolutely. Right. And
that's definitely happening.
Most likely. Yeah.
It's interesting. We've never thought of that.
Speak for yourself.
Now we're going to end the last few minutes here on this most amazing find. A Russian local discovered the frozen remains of an extinct cave lion. Hmm. This lion died 50,000 years ago, but was found perfectly preserved in the frosty ground.
Well, it's maybe 50,000 years ago. It's sometime between 25 and 55,000 years ago.
Yeah, I think they should redate this. That's pretty big, and this is an old story. I'm sure they still have this.
Yeah. Well, and it was redated. They initially thought it was only 12,000 years old.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. But the second dating is not very precise. Clearly,
I wonder what
maybe the issue is that they didn't really check the in situ environment very well, or they didn't date that well. I don't know.
Yeah, because you can literally have 6 inches up or down and go from 20 to 50,000 years ago.
Right. And there's actually two lion cubs.
Yeah, Uyan and Dina.
Yeah.
But we only get one picture.
Well, there's that video, which our viewers won't be able to hear.
Yeah, so here they are cloning the animals. So, guys, we're going to be finishing up here. It's coming in. The bumper, the mammoth conundrum. We're going to link it below. It came from a friend of the channel. We're going to get him on the show and do a whole podcast with him and discuss the problems with the 90-degree Earth flip theory. We gave you a bunch of them today in the show, a bunch of the problems.
Yeah.
And if we get him on the show, we are going to have an advanced catastrophism discussion like no other.
Perfect ending. Find us tonight on Magnetic Reversal News on YouTube at 8 p.m. Mountain Time, 10 p.m. Eastern.
Be safe. We love you.
Listen to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.